Greetings and salutations. It is I, your host, Cinema Kane. Welcome to House Matinee, the Cinema Kane Podcast. Today in the limelight, we are talking the Friday the 13th franchise. Why Friday the 13th? Well, because last year I did Halloween. Friday the 13th started out as a ripoff, quite frankly, of John Carpenter's Halloween, released a few years prior. Director Sean Cunningham was trying to save his fledgling production company, and he had produced a children's soccer film in the vein of the Bad News Bears, and it had done pretty well, so he was trying to develop a TV series around that movie. But in the meantime, he needed something to keep the production company afloat, so he created Friday the 13th with the help of Victor Miller, the screenwriter. There was a big legal battle between the two for the rights to the characters and whatnot, very recently, in fact. And as a result, I just kind of briefly want to touch on that and say both sides came off owning parts of the Friday the 13th property, particularly of that original film. So, as a result, moving forward, it looks like the only thing we're going to get Friday the 13th franchise-wise is something that the two of them will be able to agree on. So, let's hope that they can agree on some stuff, because the next installment is the 13th film in the franchise, and I think we all want that to be a good one, considering how hit and miss this franchise can be. Now, the original Friday the 13th, as previously stated, was pretty much just a cash grab at first, because it was blatantly ripping off Halloween. It took an iconic title, a date that people knew, Friday the 13th, and then it said, okay, based on this title, we'll be able to get some money. So Sean Cunningham took out a full-page ad in Variety with nothing but the title and was able to get his financing, which I want to say was $1 million or just over, and was able to produce this low-budget horror film. And while it did start off very much as a blatant cash grab off of the success of Halloween, it has now spawned one of the biggest horror franchises of all time. The only actress lending them any credibility for the original Friday the 13th was Betsy Palmer, primarily known for her acting in the 60s and 70s. She only agreed to take the job not because of the script or because she thought it was good in any way, but because she needed a new car, and what they were going to pay her was exactly the price of the new car she wanted to buy. So it's a little bit of a shame when you find out that one of your favorite parts of one of your favorite films, an actress in this case, really only took the role for selfish reasons or whatever. But at the same time, I get it, So, and from what I understand, years later, as she started to do conventions and that kind of thing, she grew to love the character of Mrs. Voorhees just a little bit more, which is great. I really do think that the original Friday the 13th is very atmospheric and creepy, and as a result, I find myself revisiting it quite often because it is so different from much of the rest of the franchise. Now, of course, I should point out that you also had a young Kevin Bacon in one of his first film appearances. Not his first, but one of his first film appearances. I always find it interesting when you're watching a horror franchise, particularly an original installment, and you get someone like a Kevin Bacon, or like in the case of Nightmare on Elm Street, a Johnny Depp, and you kind of get to see where they came from in a weird way, because a lot of these actors don't like to acknowledge the fact that they got their start in these low-budget horror movies. But the original Friday the 13th was unique for multiple reasons. As I said, it was atmospheric. It had a great young cast. The makeup effects done by the great Tom Savini still stand out to this day. You've also got characters like Crazy Ralph that really make the original Friday the 13th what it is, make it stand out. One of the original harbingers of doom in a movie like this. And it's such a great flick. It really is. And it needs to be talked more and continuously talked about over the years so that people understand that while it may have started out as a cash grab, it very much is its own thing. The music by Harry Manfredini is absolutely phenomenal. He did the majority of the soundtracks over the years. I'm pretty sure he did all but like the remake. I may be wrong on that. But I still love the music from the Friday the 13th franchise. I hear that iconic and can't help but immediately think of some of my favorite moments from this franchise. Now, while we're talking about this franchise, I should bring up a couple of things. If you saw my previous podcast from a few months ago, then you might remember that I brought up the fact that I saw Friday the 13th 1, 2, 3, 5, and 6 during TNT's Monster Vision Marathon with Joe Bob Briggs. I still love Joe Bob Briggs to this day. I watch his show on Shudder, The Last Drive-In. The Drive-In will never die. And I gotta say that the Friday the 13th franchise would probably not mean quite as much to me if it were not for how I saw it the first time. Now, along with that, let's talk about box sets, because as you can see, I've got two in the background here. I've got the original 10 set over here, as well as my Part 6 Ultimate NECA Jason. The 10 set is okay, and at one point in time was going for a lot of money on eBay. The biggest problem I have with the 10 set is, well, I have three problems. One is most of the movies are on disc with other movies. Another problem I have is the cardboard sleeves that the discs come in that scratch the disc. Don't like that. But the biggest problem I've got is the fact that Jason Goes to Hell the Final Friday was always available in its unrated format from the moment it was released on VHS and Laserdisc. For whatever reason, they decided to exclude that from the 10 set. But then over here, I've got the Shout Factory set that was released a couple of years ago, and I absolutely love that set for so many reasons. The box art, the individual cases, the one disc per movie, and the reversible artwork on the disc. It's a great way to own these movies if you want to own them in a physical format. The transfers are really great on most of them as well, which is always a plus because you never know how a company is going to treat an older franchise, particularly a horror franchise, when it comes to transfers. But the Friday the 13th films have been treated with a lot of love and loyalty, it looks like. The two box sets that are currently available, these two box sets primarily, although the 10 set is still relatively hard to find, are the only ways to currently get a hold of all the movies in one set. So, something to think about is the fact that this set, which again is the superior set, is still available right now on Amazon and on shoutfactory.com. So, something to think about should you decide you want to pick this up. I just kind of wanted to get a little bit of that out of the way. Then I wanted to talk about, before I start talking about Friday the 13th Part 2, I wanted to talk about the fact that there are 4 ways to separate the Friday the 13th franchise. Not unlike the Halloween franchise, but still different. The Halloween franchise is all about timeline. Like, here's this timeline, here's that timeline. Well, in the case of Friday the 13th, it's not so much about timeline as it is about era. So, first 8 films fall into the Paramount era. Paramount era goes from Friday the 13th to Friday the 13th Part 8, Jason Takes Manhattan. However, there are 2 eras inside of that Paramount era. The first is the pre-Zombie Jason era, and then there's the Zombie Jason era, and then there's the Jarvis trilogy, which is somehow sandwiched in between the two. We'll get to that when we get to that, but I wanted to bring it up because I will be talking about that as we explore the franchise further. So to wrap up the original film, the original Friday the 13th is atmospheric horror at its best, with a great cast, great gore effects, great music, and decent directing. The original Friday the 13th will always have a place in pop culture, and even though many will still look on it as an imitator, it did do its own thing. Friday the 13th Part 2. The original film, of course, closes out with something of a cliffhanger ending that was originally meant just to shock and surprise audiences. Jason coming out of the water is still something that is an iconic image from that first film. But now, Sean Cunningham had to up the ante for the sequel. What do we do in the sequel? Well, if Mrs. Voorhees is dead, we need her son to be our new killer. This is where we get what some people have dubbed Sackhead Jason, some people have dubbed Tater Sack Jason. Either way you want to slice it, it's good old backwoods overalls, bag over his head, Mongoloid Jason. Friday the 13th Part 2, much like Part 1, has got a stellar young cast, absolutely phenomenal gore effects, and this time around we get Steve Miner in the director's chair. Steve Miner, of course, would go on later to direct Halloween H2O. He also directed Friday the 13th Part 3. And the thing about Part 2 is, as much as I love Adrienne King, I gotta say, for me, my favorite final girl from the franchise is Amy Steele from Friday the 13th Part 2. I don't know what it is, but I just feel like her character is better in a lot of ways than Alice was in the original film. I just feel like she's tougher, she's more resilient. But of course, you can't really start your sequel until you get rid of your final girl from the first movie. Here's another little bit of trivia for you. They unintentionally almost gouged out Adrienne King's eye when they shot the scene where they were stabbing her in the temple. Not a good way to start your movie. But then we move on. We get Amy Steele's character at the camp across the street from Crystal Lake, well, across the lake from Crystal Lake, and it's a training camp for young counselors. The body count is increased, the amount of TNA is increased, and this time around we get really interesting and more dynamic shots. The biggest thing I don't like about Friday the 13th Part 2 is the fact that they killed off one of my favorite characters from the first movie. I'm glad to see that Crazy Ralph got to come back for the sequel, but the idea of killing him off, I hate that idea simply because I love Crazy Ralph. I mean, who doesn't love the character in the horror movie that always says, "Doomed, you're all doomed. I'm a messenger from God." I mean, it's just an iconic line. It's an iconic scene from an iconic franchise, and the fact that they felt the need to get rid of Crazy Ralph only to replace him with a new Harbinger of Doom, who in my opinion is not nearly as interesting in Part 3, it's just a missed opportunity to see a little bit of continuation with of continuity with the Friday the 13th franchise. Moving right along, Friday the 13th Part 3. Now here we're interested in, here we're introduced to less interesting characters than we've ever had before. The gimmick this time around is that, hey, we're going to do a Friday the 13th movie in 3D. That's cool and all if you're into 3D. And I guess the 3D works if you've been able to see it in 3D. I've only ever been able to see it in the red and blue from that set. But overall, while Steve Miner is a very competent director, as he proved with Friday the 13th Part 2, Steve Miner doesn't really up the ante in any significant way in Part 3, except to say, hey, this time we've got a gimmick. One thing I'll say is Harry Manfredini doing the disco score for Part 3 one of my favorite scores from the Friday the 13th franchise. I'm not sure what it is, if it's the synthesizer music or what, but I love that version of the theme. Now, of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't bring up the fact that in Part 3, we finally get the iconic hockey mask. This is not a NECA replica. This is just a cheap mask that I bought at a store and then customized and painted myself. I'm kind of proud of it. In fact, I've got one for every installment where he wears a hockey mask. I customized the mask to make it look approximately like it did in the film. So I'll be showing these off as I go just because I'm happy with my product and what I did there. So yeah, there's my Part 3 mask. That, of course, was taken off of Shelley after he killed Shelley. And a lot of people don't like the character of Shelley. And personally, I do. Just because you need those kinds of characters that are annoying to the other characters, because if they're annoying to the other characters, they're going to be annoying to the audience. And we need those moments of release where we can cheer when someone who annoys us or pisses us off gets taken out by Jason. One thing I'll give Part 2 over Part 3 is I felt like Jason in Part 2 was slightly scarier than Jason in Part 3. Hockey mask aside, Jason in Part 3 just doesn't come off quite as menacing to me. Now, I love the concept of how Jason looks in Part 3. I think that's great. And I love the ending of Part 3 in that they pay homage to the ending of Part 1 by having Mrs. Voorhees come out of the lake this time. I really do think that Part 3, while good, is not great and could be a lot better. So now we're getting into the first installment that they decided to label Final. Friday the 13th, the final chapter, or Friday the 13th, Part 4, the final chapter. The second installment with the iconic mask. This time around, they kill off Jason for good, or so we think. This is, hands down, my favorite of the first four. Of the first four, you've got a great atmospheric horror movie in the first one. You've got a well-shot sequel. You've got a third installment, but then Part 4 comes back with a vengeance because Tom Savini's back to kill off Jason. The makeup effects are just as good, if not better, than the original film. The cast this time around is absolutely superb. I'm unsure of this actress's name, but she did a lot of work in the 80s. I'm going to throw her picture up right here. She's in the film. She was in Weird Science, as well as several other things. Of course, you've got Crispin Glover and his iconic dance that he does in the film. And, of course, you get Corey Feldman as young Tommy Jarvis in this film. Now, the mask for the film has three different versions, because we've got a version from earlier in the film that is more evocative of the previous film, Part 3. But then as the film goes on, we get a version where the chevrons start to wear off slightly. So this is my rendition of that version of the mask. And personally, this is my favorite look of the first four when it comes to the two that had the mask in it. I just love the idea behind the chevrons getting worn off or taken off as Jason fights his way through this group of teenagers. And to me, the Part 4 mask kind of symbolizes everything that era is about in a lot of ways, because you need to see Jason kind of getting taken down somewhat so that it's believable by the end of that film that this 12-year-old kid could take him out. Personally, I think that Part 4 is a masterclass in how to shoot a slasher film. It's got great music, it's got a great cast, it's got these great effects. You can't go wrong with Part 4. It's that good. Now, if you want to say Part 4 is a class act, then what the hell do you call Friday the 13th Part 5 A New Beginning. Because Friday the 13th Part 5, A New Beginning, is the one that many people like to call the Imposter Jason movie. It's competently directed, but the director of Part 5 had only ever made adult films up to that point. So it's difficult to gauge Part 5 on anything but what was given to us. And what we got was a very trashy, very sleazy, TNA amped way up, gore amped way up. We got a slasher movie that was shot more like a late 70s adult film. So yeah, it's not a bad installment. There are characters that stick out like just as great characters. I absolutely love Reggie the Reckless, and of course his brother Demon, and I just think those are great iconic characters. And of course Reggie's grandpa is played by this guy. I forget his name off the top of my head. I'm sorry, I'll throw it up. But he was Otis in The Last Starfighter, one of my favorite movies. So to see him in Friday the 13th Part 5 was a real pleasure and delight. So yeah, when it comes to Imposter Jason or Roy, this character just does not come off as Jason the entire time you're watching him. Not only are the chevrons in the wrong place and the wrong color, but I feel like that was done to make us immediately realize, oh, this ain't Jason. And it's very evident in how this Jason was presented to us that it's not. The thing about Part 5 is that Part 5 is a movie where you're expecting one thing. You're going in expecting them to somehow figure out a way to resurrect or retcon Part 4 where they killed off Jason. They don't. In Part 5, we get a film where you barely get to know any of the characters outside of Tommy. And the few that you do get to know, you wind up liking, like Reggie. And Pam. Couldn't remember her name for a minute. And it's because you get to know those characters that you actually care when Jason/Roy starts gunning for them. Of the Tommy Jarvis trilogy, because he first appeared in Part 4, this is the second appearance of the character, it's my least favorite installment, but it is still a very good installment, even for the things that it's lacking in. I used to hate this film, but over the years, it's actually grown on me more and more to where it's actually gone up my list with regard to where it falls in my personal ranking. When the end of this video comes, I will actually rank all 12 films and tell you what I think of them. But as it is right now, we're going to talk about my favorite film in the franchise, Friday the 13th, Part 6, Jason Lives. Now, Jason Lives is a movie that is very much reminiscent of Scream and other meta horror movies, because this is the first time around that Jason has characters that are smart enough to kind of know a little bit about what's going on. They reference things like, I've seen enough scary movies to know that if you see some guy in the mask, you run the other way, or something to that effect. And I love Jason Lives. I think it's just a phenomenal installment of the franchise. And here I have my two Jason Lives masks. One is a little more accurate than the other. The other is the alternative with the bullet hole from later in the film. I think that of the two, I honestly prefer the clean version without the bullet hole, simply because the bullet hole doesn't happen until so much later in the film. The meta horror aspect mixed with the gothic sensibility of the Frankenstein-like bringing Jason back to life moment from this film makes it one of my favorite installments. my favorite installment, in fact. Although I will say it's difficult for me to say that because depending on the day of the week, Part 4 and Part 6 are somewhat interchangeable as far as being my favorite installment. The Jarvis trilogy is so different because each film in that trilogy is different. It ends the non-zombie Jason era and begins the zombie Jason era. I call it the zombie Jason era because that's what most people refer to it as in the fandom. Because Jason was brought back to life like Frankenstein's monster, a bolt of lightning through a metal rod. Ironically enough, by the very person who was trying to make sure that Jason was dead and buried forever. Tommy Jarvis, is played by Tom Matthews in this film, is absolutely phenomenal. He is a much better Tommy Jarvis than the actor we got in Part 5. And this time around, we're directed by Tom McLaughlin. And Tom McLaughlin is an absolutely brilliant director for Part 6. He manages to stay true to the Jason character while somehow taking out the gratuitous sex and nudity that was in the previous film. The gore's still amped up a little bit, but it's not nearly as effed up as it was in the previous installment. That's part of why I like Part 6, is it finds this weird way of managing what Jason is, who Jason is as a character, what the Friday the 13th franchise is, while simultaneously figuring out a way to balance it and make it more humorous and witty. Now, as far as the ending of this one is concerned, I've always felt like the ending of Part 6 makes a lot of sense because they returned Jason to his original resting place. They anchored him to a rock and chained him to the bottom of Crystal Lake. We see him down there. The last shot of the movie is him submerged underwater, chained there, unable to get loose, and a close-up shot of his eye. Still open, still awake, still alive. So, where do we go from here? Well, this was around the time the franchise was toying with the idea of teaming up Freddy and Jason in a movie together. But New Line wouldn't budge and give them the rights to Freddy. Likewise, Paramount wouldn't budge and give them the rights to Jason. So, that would have to sit on the shelf for a long time. In the meantime, what do we get? Well, we get Friday the 13th, The New Blood, Part 7, directed by makeup effects artist John Carl Buechler. And it's one of the better installments. It's the first installment with Kane Hodder as Jason. And I absolutely love Part 7 because Part 7, as I was stating before, Part 7, they wanted to do Freddy versus Jason but couldn't. So what did they do? Well, they said, let's do Jason versus Carrie. We have now got telekinetic powers in the Friday the 13th franchise. And because of this, we have a character that is able to somewhat go toe-to-toe with Jason. We also get some of the most creative kills of the franchise. The famous sleeping bag kill first appears in this particular installment. And Kane Hodder, to me, is Jason. He is the best Jason we've had up to this point. I love his version of Jason better than all the others. However, that said, I've never found any of his Jason's looks outside of Part 7's to be all that compelling. If I could figure out a way to get like the look of Part 6 or Part 4 Jason, but have it be Kane Hodder under the mask, that would have been the perfect Jason to me. Just my opinion. But Part 7's got a lot of likable and unlikable characters. Like I said, it's got a lot of great memorable deaths. The music is still stellar. And John Carl Buechler really does deliver on what he was trying to do with the franchise at that point. The biggest issue with this is that there was a work print out there that has long since been lost and or destroyed, and the only source that is currently available was a VHS tape, from what I understand, that belonged to the director. And this VHS tape was the unaltered special effects that the MPAA made them cut way the heck back for the Part 7 release. It's a what could have been had they released an unrated VHS tape at that time. It's a sad thing to know that these effects are probably lost outside of this VHS release, but I would still love to see an unedited Part 7 just because I'd be very curious to see what that film could be like. Now, finally, approaching the end of the Paramount era, we have probably one of the most divisive installments in the franchise, Jason Takes Manhattan, Friday the 13th, Part 8. Jason Takes Manhattan is one of those movies that you either love or you hate. I don't really think there's a middle ground on it. Personally, it's not my favorite, but there are aspects of it that I really do like a lot. The fact that we are on a cruise ship to New York from Crystal Lake is interesting, to say the least. We don't really get a lot of motivation for why Jason is on this cruise ship full of graduating seniors from Crystal Lake High. And then it suddenly becomes this weird movie where Jason is chasing around this group of teenagers through New York City. Yeah, I mean, it's a very cut and dry movie. Jason Takes a Boat Ride is a popular joke title for this that a lot of people like to use. It's not a great installment. I think most of us know why it's not a great installment. But that said, there are still some very atmospheric moments. There's a lot of interesting visuals. And there's a lot of what were they thinking going on when they made this. Now, here's the thing. I want to say it was starting with Part 6. They started to see diminishing returns on the box office for what they were spending on these movies. So Paramount decided they were done making Friday the 13th movies. So Sean Cunningham decides to go shop the property around. And while Paramount owned the title Friday the 13th, he owned the Jason characters and the things attached, or at least at that time he did. So, what do? Well, we go over to the house that Freddy built, New Line Cinema, to get an even more divisive film than Jason Takes Manhattan. That's right, this time around we get Jason Goes to Hell, The Final Friday. Jason Goes to Hell, The Final Friday is the Jason movie that barely has any Jason in it. Yeah. This movie said, what if Jason was a demonic slug creature that could crawl up inside of somebody and take control of their body and basically make them immortal up until the time he decides to abandon that body? We are introduced to lore that quite often doesn't make a lot of sense at times. And the director even went so far as to borrow the Necronomicon from Army of Darkness in an effort to try and basically connect Friday the 13th with Evil Dead and say that Jason was in fact a Deadite. Yeah. There are a lot of reasons to dislike Friday the 13th, Part 9, Jason Goes to Hell, The Final Friday, whatever you want to call it. My reason is for the Deadite connection. Now, I love the Evil Dead franchise, don't get me wrong. And I can understand why people love the idea of connecting the Evil Dead franchise and whatever franchise they're working on. However, this was not a good idea from the go. It just wasn't. I don't know what they were thinking. I don't know why the director felt like this was a good idea. It's my least favorite installment. Yeah, I'm actually having to think about that for a second just to make sure that I'm actually not saying the wrong thing. But yeah, it's my least favorite installment. I don't like Jason Goes to Hell, The Final Friday. Except, I like Creighton Duke. I think Creighton Duke is one of the most interesting characters added to the Friday the 13th franchise within Jason Goes to Hell, The Final Friday. But is Creighton Duke enough to make this movie worth a watch? You decide. Now, it does have some great, very creative kills, including the now famous cutting the girl in half shot. I mean, it's got some really creative kills. It does, but it's not the greatest movie in the franchise, and I just can't say I would recommend this particular film. Although, if you're watching the entire franchise, if you're going to own the entire franchise, you want it included, because eventually you'll do what I do and start doing your rewatch at some point and go, I got to revisit it. And on revisiting, you may find redeeming material, because I have done that in the past. It's like I said, I used to hate Part 5, and now I love it. Well, I don't love it, but I like it a lot better than I once did. It would then be a long, long time, like 8 years or something, like 2001, we finally got another Friday the 13th film, this time Jason X, or Jason in Space. Now, this is obviously not the Uber Jason mask. This is the mask, my attempt at the mask he has in the opening scene where he's being sentenced in the courtroom. It's not really a courtroom, but there is like a judge and a council of people there. Anyway, not the point. Jason X. A lot of people hate this movie. I get that. I do. The CGI is laughably bad. The cast, while good, is not as good as previous Friday the 13th films. And the only scene that most people tend to stand up and cheer for and say, oh, I love Jason X because of this, is the scene where they are put in a holodeck type simulator where it's supposed to be Crystal Lake circa 1980, and Jason kills a couple of teenagers, and it's meant to look like, a parody, if you will, a simulation of the old movies. The New Line era, the fourth era of the Friday the 13th franchise, which started with Jason Goes to Hell and is continuing now here with Jason X, is probably most people's least favorite era of the Friday the 13th franchise. I get it. Neither of these films have shown us anything terribly special. I feel like we would have been better served to have probably not gotten Friday the 13th for a while, because when Friday the 13th did come back again a few years later, we finally got something that had been in development hell since the mid-80s. Finally, we got Freddy vs. Jason. Freddy vs. Jason is a movie that horror fans like myself had been waiting to see from the moment we heard about it. I remember I didn't get into these movies until, the mid to late 90s, and by that point, it had already been 10 years or so since it had been talked about. So the fact that you could go online and find drafts of scripts that had been written for Freddy vs. Jason and read them and get ideas about where they were heading with it, and you had your own ideas about what they should do with it. But then we finally got the film. And to say it was underwhelming would be an overstatement. That's not entirely true, because I personally felt like that first viewing in the theater that Freddy vs. Jason was one of the greatest horror films of all time. That said, once I watched it again when I got the DVD, not so much. Freddy vs. Jason was a movie that had so much hype behind it, and the hype machine only built up as the movie's eventual release came closer and closer. The problem was that the hype machine they created couldn't live up to the movie we actually got. I don't think Freddy vs. Jason is a terrible film by any stretch of the imagination. I do, however, think that it could have been a much better film. There are some absolutely amazing dream sequences in this for the fans of the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise. There are some great throwbacks to the Friday the 13th films in here as well. However, the big complaint most people have is that this movie is more of a Freddy movie than a Jason movie, and I tend to agree with them. Not to mention, this is the first time we're getting a Jason that is not portrayed by Kane Hodder. He'd been doing it for 4 freaking movies at this point. Why in the hell didn't they bring back Kane Hodder? It would have only made sense. Of course, I am Cinema Kane after all, so maybe I'm a little bit biased. All of that said, Freddy vs. Jason is a movie that if you're doing a rewatch of the Friday the 13th franchise, or if you're doing a rewatch of the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise, you're going to want to include in the rotation. And you should, because it's a good flick. It's not a great flick, but it is a good flick. It's just my opinion. And finally, we get to the most recent and last installment, and that brings us to 2009's remake. Personally, I think the remake gets a lot of hate, and I get it, but at the same time, it could have been a lot worse. A couple of pluses. Jared Padalecki is in this. I love Supernatural. I think he's a good actor. I was happy to see that. Another thing is you got Danielle Pennebaker, who was on the Flash TV series. She's in this. She's great. Travis Van Winkle from The Last Ship. It's got a decent cast, actually. And the biggest issue I have with this is that they are trying to cram Friday the 13th 1, 2, 3, and 4 into one movie. Or at least Friday the 13th 1, 2, and 3 into one movie. The way that Jason gets his hockey mask this time is terrible. I would have almost preferred them to stick to Sackhead Jason from the earlier part of the film. But hey, we get Nana Visitor from Star Trek Deep Space Nine as Mrs. Voorhees in the opening scene. The movie is good. It ain't great. There's no denying that, but there are some good elements to the remake. Overall, those are my thoughts on the Friday the 13th franchise as it currently stands with the 12 movies that we have been presented with. Now, here's my current ranking. Friday the 13th, Part 6, Jason Lives. Friday the 13th, the final chapter, or Part 4. Friday the 13th, Part 2. Friday the 13th. Friday the 13th, Part 7. Friday the 13th, Part 5. Friday the 13th, Part 8. Friday the 13th, Friday the 13th, Jason X, Friday the 13th, Freddy vs. Jason, and then the Friday the 13th remake followed by Jason Goes to Hell. So there you go. My personal ranking. You can agree or disagree. I'd love to know what your personal rankings for these films are in the comments below. So, there you go. My overview and reviews of the Friday the 13th franchise from Part 1 all the way to the remake. Let's hope the 13th installment is good. I'm looking forward to it greatly and can't wait to hear what you thought of this podcast episode in the comments below. I hope you all have a great spooky season, and here's looking forward to the next matinee. I'm your host, Cinema Kane. If you enjoyed this podcast review of the Friday the 13th franchise, don't forget to click like. Don't forget to subscribe. Don't forget to click that bell notification so you know every time Cinema Kane has a new video uploaded. And don't forget to share this on all your social media platforms to help me grow the channel to 100 subscribers by the end of the year. I'm doing more spooky season reviews this year, so check those out too. And I'll see you next time. at the video store.